The auditorium fell silent as Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Marcus, your essay is nothing more than urban fantasy. Black children from broken homes don't become celebrated authors. They become statistics." The entire senior class watched as 17-year-old Marcus Williams stood frozen on that stage, his hands trembling as he held the paper that contained his dreams. 23 years later, that same woman would stand in her kitchen, tears streaming down her face, as she watched Marcus accept the Pulitzer Prize for fiction on live television. But how did we get from that moment of public humiliation to one of the most prestigious literary awards in America? How does a story that begins with shame, prejudice, and broken dreams transform into one of triumph, forgiveness, and the power of words to heal generational wounds? This is that story. A story about a teacher who thought she knew everything about potential, a student who refused to let anyone define his limits, and the 23-year journey that would change both of their lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I want to thank you for choosing to spend your time here with me today. Stories like this one remind us that our worst moments don't define us, but how we rise from them does. If you're ready to be inspired, to maybe see the world a little differently, then hit that subscribe button right now, and in the comments, let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from all over the world. Now let's begin. Marcus Williams was born in 1985 in the Riverside neighborhood of Detroit, Michigan. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to produce a Pulitzer Prize winner. The streets were lined with abandoned houses, their windows boarded up like closed eyes that had given up on seeing better days. But inside the small two-bedroom house on Maple Street, something different was happening. Marcus lived with his grandmother, Evelyn Williams, a woman who had worked 37 years as a seamstress at the Ford factory before it closed down. She was 68 when she took in her grandson, after his mother struggled with addiction and his father was nowhere to be found. But Evelyn had something that poverty couldn't touch: an unwavering belief in the power of education and an old trunk filled with books. Every night, after Evelyn finished her shift at the grocery store where she worked to make ends meet, she would sit with Marcus at their small kitchen table. The table was scarred and wobbly, but it became their sanctuary. Under the warm glow of a single lamp, she would listen to him read aloud from books she had collected over the years. Classics like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Invisible Man, and beloved books that spoke to struggles and triumphs, books that showed Marcus that stories had the power to change hearts and minds. Marcus was different from other kids in his neighborhood. While they played basketball or hung out on street corners, he could be found at the Detroit Public Library, filling composition notebooks with stories, poems, and observations about life around him. His teachers noticed his talent early. Mrs. Johnson in elementary school would keep his essays after class, reading them over and over, amazed at the depth of emotion this quiet boy could capture on paper. By high school, Marcus had developed a reputation. He was the kid with the worn backpack full of notebooks, the one who could make his classmates cry with a story about his grandmother's hands or laugh until their sides hurt with his observations about teenage life. His English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, encouraged him to enter writing contests, to share his work at school assemblies, to believe that his voice mattered. But there was something Marcus kept to himself. Late at night, when his grandmother thought he was asleep, he would write by the light of his phone about bigger dreams. He wrote about wanting to be a published author, about seeing his name on book covers, about using his words to bridge the gap between different worlds. He wrote about the faces in his neighborhood, the untold stories of resilience and hope that he saw every day but that never seemed to make it into the books he read in school. Marcus was 17, a senior at Eastern High School, when everything changed. The change didn't come gradually. It came all at once, on a Tuesday morning in March, during what should have been a celebration of student achievement. Eastern High School's annual Academic Excellence Assembly was supposed to be a highlight of the year. Students who had excelled in various subjects would present their work to the entire school community. Marcus had been selected to read an essay he had written about growing up in Detroit, about finding beauty in broken places, about the strength he witnessed in his community every day. He had spent weeks perfecting the piece. It was personal, raw, and honest. It talked about his grandmother's sacrifices, about neighbors who looked out for each other despite having little themselves, about dreams that persisted even when circumstances suggested they were impossible. It was the kind of writing that Mr. Rodriguez said could change minds and open hearts. The gymnasium was packed that Tuesday morning. Students filled the bleachers, faculty sat, in folding chairs on the gym floor, and even some parents and community members had come to support the presenting students. Marcus sat with the other honorees, his essay folded neatly in his hands, his grandmother's words echoing in his mind. "Baby, you tell our story with pride. You tell it true." When his name was called, Marcus walked to the podium with quiet confidence. He had practiced this moment countless times in his bedroom mirror. He began to read, his voice clear and strong, painting pictures with his words of resilience, community, and hope. The audience was engaged, leaning forward, nodding along with his observations about finding strength in struggle. But then it happened. Mrs. Henderson, the honors English teacher, who had been at Eastern High for over 20 years, stood up from her chair. She walked toward the podium with purposeful steps, her face set in a stern expression that Marcus had seen her use when disciplining students. At first, Marcus thought she was going to congratulate him or add something to what he had shared. He smiled at her approach. Instead, she took the microphone from his hands. "I need to stop this presentation," Mrs. Henderson announced to the stunned auditorium. "What you're hearing is a very creative piece of fiction, but it's being presented as reality. Marcus, your essay is nothing more than urban fantasy. Black children from broken homes don't become celebrated authors. They become statistics." The silence that followed was deafening. 500 students and dozens of adults sat in complete shock. Marcus stood frozen beside her, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice carrying across the gymnasium without the microphone. "Now, I've been teaching for 23 years and I've seen this before. These children get these grand ideas about becoming writers or artists, and we do them a disservice by encouraging unrealistic dreams. Marcus is a nice boy, but he needs to focus on practical skills, technical training, something that will actually provide for him in the real world." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He could see his classmates staring at him, some with pity, others with secondhand embarrassment. In the faculty section, he saw Mr. Rodriguez start to stand up, his face red with anger, but Principal Johnson placed a firm hand on his shoulder, shaking his head slightly. Mrs. Henderson handed the microphone back to the assembly coordinator and returned to her seat as if nothing had happened. Marcus was left standing at the podium, his essay still clutched in his hands, his dreams suddenly feeling very small and very foolish. The assembly coordinator, clearly flustered, thanked Marcus for his presentation and called the next student to present. Marcus walked back to his seat on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, could hear the whispered conversations starting around the gymnasium. That night, Marcus sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, but he couldn't bring himself to write. For the first time in years, the pages remained blank. Evelyn had heard about what happened from a neighbor whose daughter was in the audience. She sat across from her grandson, watching him stare at the empty notebook. "Baby," she said softly, "some people speak from fear, not truth." But Marcus couldn't shake Mrs. Henderson's words. They played on repeat in his mind. Black children from broken homes don't become celebrated authors. They become statistics. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been fooling himself all along. The days following the assembly were some of the darkest Marcus had ever experienced. He went to school, sat through classes, and came home, but the light that had always burned inside him seemed dimmed. His notebooks remained closed. When Mr. Rodriguez tried to talk to him about the incident, Marcus just shrugged and said he was fine. But Evelyn Williams had not raised a quitter. After watching her grandson mope for a week, she decided to take action. That Saturday morning, she woke Marcus early and told him they were going somewhere special. She had dressed in her best clothes, a navy blue dress she usually reserved for church, and she had that determined look in her eyes that Marcus knew meant business. They took 2 buses to reach downtown Detroit, to a building Marcus had never seen before. The sign outside read Detroit Writers Guild. Evelyn had done her research. She had called around, asked questions, and found out that this organization supported aspiring writers from all backgrounds. Inside, they met Sarah Chen, an Asian American woman in her 40s who coordinated the Guild's youth programs. Sarah had heard about what happened at Eastern High through the Literary Communities Network. Word had spread about the talented teenager who had been humiliated by his teacher, and several people had reached out asking how they could help. "Marcus," Sarah said as they sat in her small office, surrounded by books and literary magazines, "what happened to you was wrong. It was unprofessional. It was harmful. and it was based on outdated, prejudiced thinking. But I want you to know something important. Mrs. Henderson doesn't get to decide your future. Only you do. Sarah introduced Marcus to other young writers in the program, many of whom came from backgrounds similar to his. There was Jamal, a 19-year-old poet from the East Side who had just had his work accepted by a national magazine. There was Maria, a 17-year-old from Southwest Detroit, who was writing a novel about her family's immigrant experience. There was Kevin, whose grandparents had survived the 1967 Detroit riots and whose stories about resilience had won several local contests. For the first time since the assembly, Marcus began to believe that maybe Mrs. Henderson was wrong. Maybe there was room in the world for his voice after all. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into the Writers Guild programs. He attended workshops on craft, learned about the publishing industry, and most importantly, he met published authors who looked like him, who had come from neighborhoods like his, who had faced similar doubts and obstacles. One author in particular made a deep impression on him. James Baldwin Thompson, a Detroit native who had published 3 novels and taught creative writing at Wayne State University. Professor Thompson was in his 60s, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle voice who had grown up just 10 miles from Marcus's neighborhood. "Son," Professor Thompson told Marcus during one of their conversations, "I want you to understand something about dreams and statistics. Statistics tell us about groups, but dreams are individual. Every published author started as someone with a dream that seemed impossible to someone else. The question isn't whether kids from your background become writers. The question is whether you're willing to do the work to become the writer you want to be." Professor Thompson became Marcus's mentor. He helped him understand that writing wasn't just about talent. It was about persistence, craft, and the willingness to revise and improve constantly. He taught Marcus about the business side of writing, about building a platform, about the importance of reading widely and deeply. Under Professor Thompson's guidance, Marcus began submitting his work to literary magazines and contests. The rejections came frequently at first, form letters that stung but didn't break his spirit the way Mrs. Henderson's words had, because now he understood that rejection was part of the process, not proof that he should give up. Then came his first acceptance. A small literary magazine in Chicago accepted one of his short stories about his grandmother's hands, about the way they moved when she cooked, when she sewed, when she comforted him after a difficult day. The payment was only $50. But to Marcus, it felt like winning the lottery. He brought the published magazine to show his grandmother, and Evelyn cried when she saw her grandson's name in print. They sat at their kitchen table that night, the same table where he had learned to love reading, and Marcus read his published story aloud. It was a moment of pure joy, but it was also tinged with a sadness that Mrs. Henderson's words had created a darkness they were still working to overcome. As Marcus's senior year continued, he began applying to colleges. His grades were good, his test scores strong, and his writing portfolio was growing. Professor Thompson helped him apply for scholarships specifically designed for first-generation college students from underrepresented backgrounds. When the acceptance letters started arriving, Marcus felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. He had been accepted to several schools, including some with strong creative writing programs, but the financial aid packages varied widely, and he knew his grandmother couldn't afford to help much. The decision came down to Michigan State University, which offered him a partial scholarship and had a respected English program, or a smaller school in Ohio that offered a full scholarship but had a less established writing program. Professor Thompson advised him to choose based on where he thought he could grow most as a writer. Marcus chose Michigan State. It meant taking on some debt, meant working part-time jobs throughout college, but it also meant studying with professors who were published authors, meant being part of a larger literary community. As graduation approached, Marcus felt ready for the next chapter of his life. He had survived Mrs. Henderson's attempt to crush his dreams. He had found mentors and a community that supported his aspirations. He had even been published, proving to himself that his work had value. But he wasn't prepared for what would happen at the graduation ceremony. Eastern High School's graduation ceremony was held on a warm June evening at the school's football stadium. Families filled the metal bleachers, cameras flashed as students walked across the stage, and there was the usual mix of excitement and nostalgia that accompanies these milestone moments. Marcus sat with his classmates in the folding chairs on the field, his grandmother beaming at him from the stands. He was graduating with honors, had been accepted to college, and had even received a small scholarship from the Detroit Writers Guild for his continued literary work. Despite everything that had happened, he felt proud of what he had accomplished. The ceremony proceeded normally until Principal Johnson announced the Special Recognition Awards. These were given to students who had overcome significant challenges or made outstanding contributions to the school community. Marcus wasn't expecting to receive one, so he was surprised when his name was called. As he walked toward the stage, he saw Mrs. Henderson sitting with the other faculty members. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the confident certainty she had shown during the assembly incident. It looked almost like discomfort. Principal Johnson handed Marcus a certificate recognizing his literary achievements and his representation of the school in various writing competitions throughout the year. As he shook the principal's hand, he heard his name being called from the faculty section. Mrs. Henderson was standing up, walking toward the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Not again. Not here. Not at graduation. Not in front of his grandmother and the entire community. But when Mrs. Henderson reached the microphone, what she said surprised everyone, including Marcus. "I'd like to say something about Marcus Williams," she began, her voice slightly shaky. "Earlier this year, I made a mistake, a big one. I let my own limitations and fears guide my words, and I said things that were harmful and wrong. Marcus, I owe you an apology." The stadium grew quiet. Even the usual chatter and movement that accompanies large gatherings seemed to stop. Marcus stood frozen on the stage, certificate in hand, staring at his teacher in disbelief. "I told you that young people from your background don't become successful writers," Mrs. Henderson continued. "I was wrong, dead wrong. Not only was that statistically incorrect, it was cruel and unprofessional. Over the past few months, I've been doing some research, learning about the many successful authors who came from similar backgrounds, reading about the importance of encouraging all students to pursue their dreams." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "You have talent, Marcus, real talent. And you have something even more important than talent. You have determination and heart. I'm sorry for trying to dim your light. I'm sorry for letting my own narrow worldview hurt you. And I want everyone here to know that I believe you will succeed as a writer. And when you do, I'll be proud to say I once taught you." The applause that followed was thunderous. Students, families, and faculty members stood up, clapping not just for Mrs. Henderson's apology, but for the courage it must have taken to admit such a public mistake. Marcus felt tears in his eyes as he looked out at the crowd, finding his grandmother's face in the stands. She was crying too, but she was also smiling the biggest smile he had ever seen. After the ceremony, as families gathered on the field for photos and congratulations, Mrs. Henderson approached Marcus and his grandmother. Up close, Marcus could see that she had been crying. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I hope you can forgive me. What I did was inexcusable, but I want you to know that it came from my own fears and limitations, not from anything real about you or your potential." Marcus looked at this woman who had caused him so much pain and self-doubt. Part of him wanted to tell her how many nights he had gone to bed, questioning his dreams because of her words. Part of him wanted to describe the darkness she had brought into his life. Instead, he found himself thinking about his grandmother's teachings about forgiveness, about Professor Thompson's lessons on turning pain into powerful writing, about the community of writers who had embraced him and shown him that success comes in many forms. "Mrs. Henderson," he said finally, "I forgive you, and I want you to know that what happened actually made me stronger. It forced me to find my real community, to work harder, to prove to myself that I could overcome obstacles. In a strange way, you gave me a gift." Mrs. Henderson broke down completely then, sobbing in the middle of the crowded field. Marcus's grandmother, showing the grace that had defined her entire life, stepped forward and hugged the woman who had hurt her grandson. "We all make mistakes, honey," Evelyn said gently. "What matters is what we do after we make them." That night, Marcus sat at his grandmother's kitchen table one more time before leaving for college. He opened his notebook and began to write about forgiveness, about the complexity of human nature, about how our worst moments and our best moments are often separated by our willingness to grow and change. It was the beginning of what would become his first novel. Marcus's college years at Michigan State were transformative. He studied creative writing under Professor Linda Morrison, a published novelist who pushed him to dig deeper into his characters and themes. He worked part-time at the campus bookstore, surrounded by thousands of books that reminded him daily of his goals. He joined the literary magazine staff, and eventually became editor during his senior year. But more importantly, he continued to develop his unique voice as a writer. His stories often focused on working-class characters, on families shaped by economic hardship, on communities that found strength and solidarity. Critics would later describe his work as having an authentic understanding of resilience in the face of systemic challenges. During his junior year, Marcus began working on a novel based loosely on his own experiences growing up in Detroit. The story followed a young man raised by his grandmother, navigating questions of identity, dreams, and belonging in a world that often seemed designed to limit his possibilities. Professor Morrison encouraged him to submit portions of the novel in progress to various contests and publications. One chapter, published in a prestigious literary quarterly, caught the attention of a literary agent in New York who specialized in diverse voices and stories from underrepresented communities. The agent, Rebecca Martinez, reached out to Marcus during his senior year. She had read his published work and was interested in seeing the complete novel when it was finished. For Marcus, this felt like a dream come true. Here was a real literary agent, someone who worked with published authors, who believed his work had commercial potential. Marcus graduated from Michigan State with honors and a degree in English with a creative writing concentration. He had been accepted to several graduate programs in creative writing, but he decided to defer enrollment for a year to focus on completing his novel and working with Rebecca to try to find a publisher. He moved back in with his grandmother, returning to the same small house on Maple Street where his writing journey had begun. But now he had a different relationship with that kitchen table. Instead of homework and reading assignments, he spread out chapters of his novel, revision notes, and correspondence with his agent. The process of finding a publisher proved to be more challenging than Marcus had expected. Rebecca submitted the novel to several publishers, and while the responses were generally positive about Marcus's writing ability, many editors felt the story was too specific or worried about the marketability of stories focused on working-class Black communities. After 6 months of rejections, Marcus began to wonder if Mrs. Henderson had been right after all. Maybe the publishing world really wasn't ready for voices like his. Maybe he was naive to think that his stories would find an audience. It was during this period of doubt that something unexpected happened. Rebecca called with news that would change everything. "Marcus," she said, barely containing her excitement, "I just got off the phone with Jennifer Walsh at Beacon Press. She's not just interested in your novel, she's passionate about it. She wants to schedule a call with you this week." Beacon Press was a respected independent publisher, known for taking chances on debut authors and publishing socially conscious literature. Jennifer Walsh, their fiction editor, had built a reputation for discovering new talent and nurturing writers whose work addressed important social themes. The phone call with Jennifer exceeded Marcus's wildest expectations. She didn't just want to publish his novel, she understood it. She talked about the importance of stories that showed the full humanity of working-class communities, about readers who were hungry for authentic voices, about the power of literature to build empathy and understanding across different experiences. "Marcus," Jennifer said during their conversation, "your novel doesn't just tell a story, it opens a window into a world that many readers have never seen portrayed with this kind of depth and respect. This is exactly the kind of book we want to champion." The contract and negotiations moved quickly. While the advance wasn't huge by industry standards, it was enough for Marcus to support himself while the book went through the editing and production process. More importantly, he was going to be a published novelist at age 23. When Marcus called his grandmother to share the news, Evelyn's response was simple but profound. "I always knew this day would come, baby. I just knew it." The novel, titled Maple Street Dreams, was published 18 months later. It told the story of Jerome, a young man growing up with his grandfather in Detroit, navigating family secrets, economic hardship, and the challenge of maintaining hope in difficult circumstances. While the story was fiction, readers and critics recognized the authentic emotional truth that came from Marcus's own experiences. The book received positive reviews in several major publications. The Detroit Free Press called it a powerful debut that captures the resilience and dignity of urban communities too often portrayed as statistics rather than human beings. The Chicago Tribune described Marcus as a young writer with an old soul and a gift for finding grace in struggle. More importantly for Marcus, the book found its audience. He received letters from readers who saw their own experiences reflected in his characters, from young people who felt inspired to pursue their own dreams, from teachers who were using the book in their classrooms to discuss themes of perseverance and community. One letter in particular moved him deeply. It was from a high school student in Milwaukee who had grown up in circumstances similar to Marcus's. "Your book made me feel like my story matters too," the student wrote. Thank you for showing me that kids like us can become writers. As Marcus prepared for his first book tour, he thought about Mrs. Henderson's apology at graduation. He wondered if she knew about his success, if she remembered her words about statistics and realistic expectations. He decided to find out. 5 years had passed since Marcus's graduation from Eastern High School. Maple Street Dreams had been well received, selling modestly but steadily, and earning Marcus invitations to speak at schools and literary events across the Midwest. He was working on his second novel while teaching part-time at a community college, helping other aspiring writers develop their craft. It was during a book signing at a library in suburban Detroit that Marcus ran into someone from his past. Mrs. Johnson, his elementary school teacher who had first recognized his writing talent, approached him with a warm smile and a copy of his book. "Marcus Williams," she said, embracing him warmly, "I am so proud of you. I always knew you had something special." As they caught up, Mrs. Johnson mentioned that she had recently retired from teaching, but stayed in touch with many of her former colleagues, including some from Eastern High School. "You know," she said carefully, "Margaret Henderson has talked about you quite a bit over the years. She followed your success, bought your book, even used some of your published short stories in her classes. I think what happened at that assembly has weighed on her more than you might realize." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this. Part of him was glad that Mrs. Henderson had recognized her mistake and seemed to have learned from it. Part of him was still hurt by the memory of that day and the months of self-doubt that followed. Mrs. Johnson seemed to sense his conflicted feelings. "She's been different since then, Marcus. More encouraging with her students, more careful about the power of her words. I think what happened with you taught her something important about the responsibility teachers have." That conversation stayed with Marcus as he continued his book tour and worked on his second novel. He found himself thinking about Mrs. Henderson, about forgiveness, about the complicated ways that painful experiences can lead to growth for everyone involved. His second novel, Voices in the Distance, was published 3 years later to even stronger reviews. This book explored themes of family, identity, and the way traumatic experiences shape, but don't have to define us. The story followed multiple characters across 2 generations, showing how pain and healing can be passed down through families. The book was nominated for several literary awards and won the Great Lakes Book Award for fiction. More importantly for Marcus, it established him as a serious literary voice, someone whose work was being studied in universities and discussed in book clubs across the country. It was around this time that Marcus began receiving invitations to speak at high schools about pursuing creative careers despite obstacles. These talks were among his favorite professional activities. He loved meeting young writers, sharing his story, and encouraging them to persist through rejection and doubt. During one such visit to a high school in Grand Rapids, a student asked him about dealing with people who don't believe in your dreams. Marcus found himself telling the story of Mrs. Henderson, of the assembly incident, and of the long journey toward forgiveness and understanding. "The thing I learned," Marcus told the students, "is that people who try to limit your dreams are usually speaking from their own fears and limitations. But those experiences, as painful as they are, can actually make your work stronger if you let them. Some of my best writing has come from processing difficult emotions and experiences." After the talk, the school's English department chair approached Marcus. "That story about your teacher," she said, "have you ever considered reaching out to her? I think she would want to know how her apology affected you, how you've grown from that experience." Marcus had been thinking the same thing. As he had matured as a writer and as a person, he had come to understand that healing often requires completing circles, addressing unfinished emotional business. He decided it was time to reach out to Mrs. Henderson. Finding her contact information proved easier than he expected. She was still teaching at Eastern High School, now in her 28th year in the classroom. Marcus sent her a carefully written email, introducing himself in case she didn't remember him, mentioning his published work, and asking if she would be willing to meet for coffee to talk about their shared experience. Mrs. Henderson responded within hours. Her email was warm but also clearly emotional. She told him how proud she was of his success, how sorry she remained about the assembly incident, and how much she would welcome the chance to talk with him. They met at a small cafe halfway between Marcus's apartment and the school. Mrs. Henderson looked older than Marcus remembered, her hair now completely gray, but her eyes were kind and attentive as she listened to him talk about his journey as a writer. "Marcus," she said when he finished sharing about his career, "I need you to know that what I did to you was the worst moment of my teaching career. not just because it was wrong, but because it went against everything I believe about education and encouraging young people. She went on to explain that she had been going through a difficult time in her personal life when the assembly incident occurred. Her father had recently died, she was dealing with financial stress, and she had been feeling generally pessimistic about her students' futures given the challenges they faced. "None of that excuses what I did," she said firmly. "But I want you to understand that it wasn't really about you. It was about my own fears and frustrations. You just happened to be the target of emotions that had nothing to do with your talent or potential." Marcus listened carefully, recognizing the courage it took for her to be so honest and vulnerable. He told her about the months of doubt following the incident, but also about how it had ultimately led him to find mentors and a community that supported his work. "In a strange way," Marcus said, "that day changed my life for the better. It forced me to seek out people who really understood and supported what I was trying to do. It made me more determined to succeed." Mrs. Henderson began to cry then, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. "I've carried the guilt of that day for 8 years," she said. "Knowing that something good came from it, that you found your way despite what I did, means more to me than you could know." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Mrs. Henderson made a request that surprised Marcus. "Would you consider coming back to Eastern High to speak to my students? I think they would benefit so much from hearing your story, and honestly, I think it would help me close this chapter of my own story." Marcus agreed immediately. It felt like the perfect way to complete the circle that had begun on that painful day 8 years earlier. The day Marcus returned to Eastern High School to speak was crisp and clear, one of those October afternoons when the light slants through windows in a way that makes everything seem touched by gold. He walked through the same hallways he had navigated as a student, past the gymnasium where his dreams had been challenged, toward the library where he would share his story with a new generation of students. Mrs. Henderson met him at the entrance, and Marcus was struck by how different she seemed. There was a lightness about her that hadn't been there during their coffee meeting, as if she had been carrying a weight that was finally lifting. The library was packed with students, not just from Mrs. Henderson's classes, but from throughout the school. Word had spread that a published author, an Eastern High graduate, was coming to speak, and the librarian had decided to open the event to anyone who was interested. As Marcus looked out at the faces in the audience, he saw himself 8 years earlier. Young people with dreams and doubts, with talents they weren't sure how to develop, with obstacles that seemed overwhelming. He saw students who looked like him, students from different backgrounds, all of them trying to figure out how to turn their aspirations into reality. He began by reading a passage from Maple Street Dreams, the same essay he had been trying to read at the assembly 8 years earlier, now refined and polished through years of writing and revision. The students listened intently, drawn into the world he created with his words. Then he told them his story. He talked about growing up with his grandmother, about discovering his love of writing, about the day in this very school when someone told him his dreams were unrealistic. He talked about the doubt that followed, about finding mentors and community, about the long process of becoming a published author. But most importantly, he talked about resilience, about the power of persisting through rejection and criticism, about the importance of finding people who believe in your potential even when others don't. "The most important thing I want you to understand," Marcus told the students, "is that other people's limitations don't have to become your limitations. When someone tells you that people like you don't succeed in a particular field, what they're really telling you is that they haven't met enough people like you who have succeeded. They're speaking from limited experience, not universal truth." During the question and answer session, a young woman in the back row raised her hand. "Mr. Williams," she said, "what do you say to the voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough?" Marcus smiled, recognizing his younger self in her question. "I tell that voice that it doesn't get to make the decision about my worth or my potential. Only I get to do that. And then I write anyway, even when I don't feel good enough, because the act of writing is how I become good enough." As the event concluded and students began filing out, many of them stopped to thank Marcus or ask for advice about their own writing. Mrs. Henderson waited until the room was nearly empty before approaching him. "Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "thank you for forgiving me, for coming back, for showing these kids what's possible." This felt like healing. Marcus hugged his former teacher, understanding that some stories don't end with revenge or continued anger, but with the harder and more powerful choice of forgiveness and growth. 2 years later, Marcus Williams won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for his third novel, The Weight of Dreams, a sweeping story about 3 generations of a Detroit family and their relationship to hope, loss, and persistence. The book was praised for its unflinching honesty about economic hardship combined with a profound understanding of human dignity and resilience. On the morning the Pulitzer Prize was announced, Mrs. Henderson sat in her kitchen, watching the news coverage with tears streaming down her face. Later that day, she sent Marcus a simple text message. "I always knew you would make it. Congratulations on proving that dreams and statistics are very different things." Marcus kept that text message, not because he needed her validation anymore, but because it represented something important about human capacity for growth, change, and redemption. It reminded him that the best stories, both in literature and in life, are often about people becoming better than they once were. Today, Marcus Williams continues to write, teach, and speak about the power of persistence in the face of doubt. His books are taught in schools across the country, including at Eastern High School, where Mrs. Henderson uses his work to teach her students about finding their own voices and believing in their potential. The last line of The Weight of Dreams, the novel that earned him the Pulitzer Prize, reads, "Sometimes the heaviest dreams are the ones most worth carrying, because they teach us that we are stronger than we ever imagined possible." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition Marcus ever received came not from a prestigious literary award, but from a letter he received 3 months after winning the Pulitzer. It was from Mrs. Henderson, now retired after 35 years of teaching. "Dear Marcus," the letter began, "I watched you accept the Pulitzer Prize on television, and I cried for 20 minutes straight. Not tears of sadness, but tears of joy and gratitude. Joy for your incredible achievement, and gratitude that I got to witness, even in a small way, the journey of someone who refused to let anyone else define their limits. I want you to know that our story has become part of how I think about teaching and about the responsibility we have to nurture rather than limit our students' dreams. I've shared it with young teachers, used it in workshops about the power of words, and most importantly, I've used it to remind myself every day that our job as educators is to help students discover what's possible, not to impose our own limitations on their futures. You once told me that what happened between us made you stronger, and I believe that's true. But I also want you to know that knowing you, watching your success, and experiencing your forgiveness has made me a better teacher and a better person. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to become who we're meant to be. With deep respect and pride, Margaret Henderson. P.S. I bought copies of all your books for the Eastern High School Library. There's a small plaque next to them that reads, 'Dreams donated by a graduate who refused to become a statistic.'" Marcus kept that letter on his desk as he worked on his 4th novel, a story about teachers and students, about the complicated ways we influence each other's lives, about the power of second chances and third chances, and as many chances as it takes for us to get it right. Because the most important lesson Marcus learned wasn't about writing or publishing, or even about overcoming obstacles. It was about the truth that our worst moments don't define us, but what we choose to do after those moments can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. The kitchen table where it all began still sits in his grandmother's house on Maple Street. Evelyn Williams, now 83, still lives there, still proud of her grandson who proved that dreams and statistics are indeed very different things. Sometimes Marcus visits and they sit at that table together, reading passages from his latest work aloud, just like they did when he was 7 years old and first falling in love with the power of words. And sometimes, when the light hits the table just right, Marcus can see all the stories that began there. Stories of struggle and triumph, of pain and healing, of a young man who refused to let anyone else's limitations become his own truth. That's the real story behind the Pulitzer Prize, behind the successful career, behind all the recognition and awards. It's the story of a kitchen table, a grandmother's love, a teacher's cruelty and eventual growth, and a young man who learned that the most powerful response to "you can't" is simply "watch me." Marcus Williams is still writing, still teaching, still proving every day that statistics are about groups, but dreams are about individuals. And every time he sits down to write, every time he helps a young writer find their voice, every time he speaks to students about persistence and possibility, he honors not just his own journey, but the journey of everyone who has ever been told their dreams are too big, too unrealistic, too impossible. Because in the end, the most important stories aren't just about individual success, they're about the ripple effects of that success. about how one person's refusal to give up can inspire countless others to keep going, to keep dreaming, to keep believing that their voices matter and their stories are worth telling. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all.